Hey guys, tonight we're not walking through the halls of kings or across dusty battlefields. We won't be following heroes on their grand quests. Instead, we're stepping quietly into the divine garden of Olympus, not to admire the flowers that bloom there, but to gaze upon the ones that were trampled underfoot, the ones crushed, not by hatred, but by a force far more dangerous and unpredictable, the love of a god. It's an affection that doesn't shelter, but exposes, a passion that doesn't warm, but burns. Tonight, we explore the chilling truth that in the world of Greek myths, to capture the attention of a god was to invite ruin. Their love was a curse, their desire a cage, and for the mortals who were chosen, their stories rarely had a happy ending. If this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments which of these tales you remember from long ago. There is a strange comfort in knowing we are all listening to the same quiet tragedies under the same night sky. Now, dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let the world settle around you, and let's explore why. In the world of Greek myths, being loved by a god was often the worst thing that could happen to you. Before we meet the souls touched by this divine fire, let us first climb back to Mount Olympus at twilight. Imagine it now, as the last golden light fades gently behind marble colonnades, and the air smells faintly of ambrosia and distant, forgotten prayers. This is the home of the gods, the celestial seat of power, a place that seems serene from afar, but is, in truth, a theater of impulse. The gods, you see, were not beings of quiet contemplation or predictable morality. They were hurricanes of feeling, divine embodiments of raw, untamed human emotion. They were capricious, passionate, thunderous, and petty. Their affection, when it fell upon a mortal, was rarely a gentle rain. It was a lightning strike, brilliant, terrifying, and utterly consuming. To understand why their love was so ruinous, we must first understand that it was not love as we know it. It was not a meeting of equals, built on empathy or shared vulnerability. It was possession. It was desire born from absolute power and an equally absolute lack of boundaries. The Olympians loved a mortal the way a child loves a new toy, with an all-consuming fascination that is intense, selfish, and ultimately destructive. The toy is cherished for its beauty, for the joy it brings its owner, but the child rarely considers what the toy itself might feel. It can be dressed up, played with, and when the fascination wanes or another toy catches the eye, it can be forgotten, or worse, broken in a fit of pique. There is no better example of this than the king of the gods himself. Zeus, ruler of the sky, lord of thunder, and keeper of cosmic order, governed his own heart with pure anarchy. His love life was a catalogue of tragedies disguised as romances. He saw a mortal woman he desired, and he took. He transformed himself into a swan, a bull, a shower of gold, whatever it took to bypass consent and satisfy his impulse. He never seemed to pause to consider the consequences for the women he pursued. To him, they were fleeting moments of pleasure, additions to his long list of conquests. But for the mortals, his affection was a cataclysm. Each affair was a stone tossed into the placid waters of a human life, and the ripples were always waves of tragedy. The affair itself was often just the beginning of the horror. His divine attention almost always drew a second, far more dangerous gaze, that of his wife, Hera. As the goddess of marriage, she took Zeus's infidelities not just as a personal insult, but as an affront to her very existence. And since she could not punish the king of the gods, she aimed her legendary vengeance at the mortals who were often his victims, and at the children born from these unions. And so, the gift of Zeus's love became a multi-generational curse. To be loved by him was to be hunted by her. To bear his child was to give birth to a hero destined for a life of extraordinary suffering. Heracles, Perseus, Dionysus, their lives were epic, but they were also paved with pain, labors, and loss, all stemming from the single fact that their father was a god who could not control himself. His love wasn't a shield. It was the very thing you needed shielding from. It was a divine spotlight that made you a target for everyone, and it would, sooner or later, burn you to ash. It often began, not with an act, but with a glance. A quiet, passing moment where the gaze of a god, sweeping across the mortal realm, would snag on a single, luminous thread. That thread was almost always beauty. In the world of mortals, great beauty could be a gift, a key that opened doors to wealth or a good marriage. But, in the eyes of the gods, exceptional beauty was not a gift. It was a provocation. It was a beacon that shone from the earth all the way to the gilded halls of Olympus. And with that divine attention came ruin. You did not have to be vain, or proud, or ambitious. You simply had to exist, beautifully, and that was often enough to set your tragedy in motion. Consider the fate of Psyche, a mortal princess whose beauty was so profound it was said to rival that of Aphrodite herself. Mortals began to travel for miles just to glimpse her face, whispering that she must be the goddess of love, reincarnated in flesh and bone. They neglected Aphrodite's temples, letting her statues gather dust while they laid garlands at the feet of a girl. Psyche, for her part, never asked for this worship. She felt hollow and alone, celebrated but untouched, like a living painting admired by all but known by none. Her beauty had become a curse that isolated her from the one thing she truly wanted simple: human affection. But on Mount Olympus, Aphrodite did not see a lonely girl. She saw an insult. She saw a mortal usurping her power, stealing her worshippers, and her divine envy twisted into a cold, calculated hatred. And so, before Psyche had ever known a lover's touch, a goddess's rage had already sealed her fate. Her story, which should have been one of finding love, was instead destined to become a series of impossible trials, all because her face had angered a god. And this was the cruelest part of the game the mortal had no move to make. They were caught in a divine trap from which there was no escape. To refuse a god's advances, as the nymph Daphne did with Apollo, was an act of defiance. It wounded their pride, and a god's wounded pride was a dangerous thing. It turned their desire into a relentless, terrifying hunt, and the mortal's only escape was often a transformation that erased their very humanity. But what if they accepted? What if they yielded to the advances of a god like Zeus? To do so was to paint a target on your back for his queen. Hera's fury was legendary, and it was never aimed at her unfaithful husband, but at the women he pursued and the children they bore. A moment of divine passion for them meant a lifetime of being tormented, transformed, and hounded to the ends of the earth. Their choice was an illusion. The moment a god's gaze fell upon them, their story was no longer their own. It became a new, tragic chapter in the endless, dysfunctional family drama of the Olympians. And in that story, the mortal was never the hero. They were merely the beautiful, breakable object at the center of the plot. And so, we begin. Our first story unfolds not in a dark forest or a forgotten cave, but in a royal bedchamber in the great city of Thebes. Here lived a princess named Semele, and she had a secret, a divine secret. She was loved by Zeus. He came to her not in a storm of thunder or a shower of gold, but quietly, in the guise of a mortal man. His divinity was a cloak he wore lightly, and in the stillness of the night, he was just a lover, his voice a low rumble, his touch a gentle warmth. Semele, for her part, was deeply in love. She knew nothing of Olympus or jealous queens. She only knew the man who visited her when the world was asleep, the man who made her feel as though she were the only person on earth. She carried his child, a new life blooming within her, and she believed, with all the certainty of a happy heart, that their love was a fortress, but no fortress on earth can stand against the envy of a god. High on Olympus, Hera watched. She saw the secret meetings, the stolen glances, the growing life inside the mortal princess. And she felt that familiar, cold fire of betrayal rise within her. She would not allow this. This mortal girl would not be given the honor that was hers alone. Hera descended from her golden throne, cloaking her divine fury in the comforting disguise of an old woman, Beroe, who had been Semele's trusted nursemaid since childhood. She hobbled into the princess's chambers, her face a mask of loving concern. She listened as Semele, giddy with her secret, confessed her love for a powerful, mysterious man. And then Hera planted the seed of poison, her words wrapped in the sweet language of care. "But my child," the old woman whispered, her voice cracking with feigned worry, "how can you be sure the world is full of tricksters? How do you know he is truly the great Zeus? Men will say anything to win a woman's heart." Semele's smile faltered. The nursemaid pressed on. "If he truly loves you, if you are truly as important to him as his own queen, then ask him for a sign. Ask him to come to you, not as a man, but as he comes to Hera in all his divine glory. A god would not deny the woman he loves such a simple proof." The words took root in Semele's heart, where love and pride and a desperate need for validation began to churn. Was she just another mortal conquest, or was she truly loved? The doubt, once planted, began to grow, overshadowing everything else. The next time Zeus came to her, she did not greet him with a kiss, but with a request. She made him promise her, made him swear an oath on the black, unforgiving waters of the river Styx, that he would grant her any one wish she asked. It was a vow that not even the king of the gods could break. Zeus, blinded by his affection, swore the oath immediately. And then Semele made her wish, the words tumbling out, laced with all of Hera's venomous logic. "Show me who you truly are," she pleaded. "Come to me as you come to your wife. I want to see you in all your glory." A terrible stillness filled the room. Zeus's face fell, for he knew instantly what this meant. He begged her to choose another wish, anything else. He explained that no mortal could withstand the sight of his true form, that his glory was not a vision, but a fire that consumed all it touched. But her mind was set, poisoned by doubt. The oath was sworn. There was no turning back. With a heavy heart, he returned to Olympus, choosing his smallest thunderbolts, dimming his radiance as much as he was able. But it was no use. When he appeared in her chambers, the room did not just fill with light. It became the heart of a star, and Semele, a fragile mortal vessel, could not endure it. She was consumed in an instant, turned to ash by the very sight she had longed to see, incinerated by the love she had begged to be shown. But the story of Semele does not end entirely in ash and silence. In the smoldering ruins of the royal chamber, amidst the scent of ozone and burnt linen, something divine survived. Zeus, gazing upon what was left of the woman he claimed to love, saw a flicker of immortal life within the embers. The child, his child, in a desperate, almost gruesome act of divine obstetrics, he reached into the pyre and snatched the unborn infant from the ashes. The child was not yet ready for the world, a fragile, premature being who could not survive on his own. And since there was no longer a mother's womb to shelter him, Zeus provided his own. He cut open his own thigh, placed the tiny, developing god inside, and sewed the flesh shut, turning his own body into a bizarre, masculine womb. He would carry the child to term himself. Months later, the child was born for a second time. First from his mother's fire, and then from his father's flesh. He was named Dionysus, the twice-born god. This is the great, terrible irony of Semele's tale. The love that destroyed the mortal woman gave birth to an immortal god. A god of wine, of theater, of madness and ecstasy, a deity whose entire existence was a celebration of breaking boundaries and losing oneself. Perhaps because his own birth was the result of the ultimate boundary between mortal and divine being so violently shattered. Dionysus would go on to wander the earth, followed by wild festivities, bringing both joy and terror, a living paradox born from a moment of love that was also a moment of death. And what of Semele? She is a footnote in her own son's story. She exists in mythology not as a character, but as a catalyst. Her only legacy was her own destruction. Her love, her doubt, her horrific death, it all became the strange and tragic prologue for the story of a male god. This is why it sucked to be Semele. It sucked because her love was not a connection. It was a cosmic mistake. She gave her heart, her body, her trust, and ultimately her life. In return, she received oblivion. She wasn't cherished, she was used, first by Zeus's desire and then by Hera's wrath. She was not a partner in a love story. She was the kindling used to start a divine fire. And once she was consumed, all that was left was a god she would never know, and a cautionary tale that would rarely remember her name with the kindness she deserved. Her story is a testament to the fact that for a mortal, the warmth of a god's love was indistinguishable from the fire that burns you alive. If Semele's tale shows the fiery, consuming danger of a god's love, our next story reveals its chilling power to twist, deform, and isolate. Our journey now takes us from the ashes of Thebes to the sacred precincts of Argos, and to a priestess named Io. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was sworn to the service of Hera herself. You might think this would have offered her some divine protection, that she would be safe within the domain of the Queen of Olympus. You would be wrong. Her position only made her tragedy more exquisitely ironic. Zeus desired her. As with so many others, his desire was a storm she could not outrun. He came to her in her dreams, his voice a persistent whisper, urging her to meet him in the meadows of Lerna. Io, terrified, resisted and told her father, who consulted an oracle. The oracle's message was grim. Expel your daughter from your home, or your entire line will be struck down by Zeus's thunderbolt. And so, with heavy hearts, her family cast her out, leaving her to her divine pursuer. But Hera, with an intuition sharpened by centuries of her husband's infidelities, sensed something was amiss. Her shadow fell upon the land, and Zeus, caught in his pursuit, panicked. In a moment of divine cowardice, he did not stand and fight for Io. He did not shield her from his wife's wrath. He hid her. With a wave of his hand, the beautiful priestess vanished, and in her place stood a flawless white heifer, a cow with wide, soulful eyes that still held the confusion and terror of a human girl. Hera arrived to find her husband admiring this lovely new animal. Her smile was as cold as marble. She knew. Of course, she knew. She played her part with masterful precision, praising the cow's beauty and asking for it, ever so graciously, as a gift. Zeus, trapped in his own clumsy lie, could not refuse without revealing everything. He handed the cow-handed Io over to his wife, and so Io was passed from one tormentor to another. Hera, now in possession of her rival, did not place her in a simple pasture. She assigned a guardian, a creature perfectly suited for a prison of perpetual vigilance, Argus Panoptes, a giant with 100 sleepless eyes set all over his body. While some of his eyes would sleep, others would always remain open, always watching. Imagine her torment. She was trapped inside the clumsy, alien body of a beast, her voice only a mournful, meaningless lowing. She wandered the fields she once knew as a girl, and her own father would stroke her neck, offering her grass, never knowing the creature he pitied was his own daughter. She saw her sisters and could not speak their names. In one heart-wrenching moment, she tried to scratch her name in the dust with her hoof, a desperate plea to be recognized, but the message was lost. She was just a cow, and always, always, the gaze of Argus was upon her. There was no rest, no privacy, no moment of peace. She drank from muddy streams and ate bitter grass, forever watched by a monster. This was her existence, day after agonizing day. A prison of flesh, guarded by a creature from a nightmare. All because the king of the gods had desired her for a fleeting moment and was too cowardly to protect her from the consequences. Zeus, from his high throne on Olympus, could see Io's suffering. Perhaps a flicker of guilt, a whisper of responsibility, stirred in his divine heart. He could not bear to see her so utterly broken by a fate he had created. And so, he decided to intervene. He summoned the most clever and cunning of the gods, the divine messenger, the patron of thieves and tricksters, with winged sandals on his feet, Hermes. Hermes descended to earth, not with a flashing sword, but with a shepherd's reed pipe and a quiet plan. He sat beside the great giant Argus, and, under the guise of a fellow traveler, he began to play. His music was soft, a meandering, hypnotic melody that seemed to mimic the buzzing of bees and the rustling of leaves. Then he began to talk, his voice a low, monotonous drone, telling endless, boring tales that went nowhere. The giant, who had never known true rest, listened, and one by one, the 100 eyes of Argus Panoptes began to droop, to flicker, and to close. When the last eye was finally sealed in a deep, magical slumber, Hermes drew his curved blade and swiftly, silently, ended the giant's watch forever. But Eo's moment of relief was tragically brief. When Hera discovered the lifeless body of her faithful servant, she was overcome with a storm of rage and grief. In an act of strange, mournful artistry, she carefully gathered the 100 eyes from Argus's corpse. She took them and placed them, one by one, onto the tail of her favorite bird, the peacock, and they remain there to this day, a shimmering, ever-watching memorial to her fury, and a reminder that the Queen of the Gods never, ever forgets. For Io, Hera devised a new, more maddening torture. She sent a gadfly, a vicious, stinging insect, to pursue the poor heifer relentlessly. The fly's sting drove Io into a constant state of pain and madness. She fled. Her quiet, mournful existence exploded into a frantic, world-spanning marathon of terror. She ran across the fields of Greece, forded rivers, swam across the sea that would later be named the Ionian in her honor. She galloped across continents, through wild lands and foreign cities, a creature possessed by agony. There was no rest, no hiding. The gadfly was always there, a tiny, buzzing embodiment of a goddess's infinite hatred. This was Zeus's liberation. He did not change her back. He did not confront his wife. He simply traded one prison for another, from a guarded pasture to a world-sized cage of endless, panicked flight. It sucked to be Io because the god who claimed to love her was too cowardly to protect her, and the goddess who hated her was too powerful to escape. She was a living testament to their toxic marriage, a casualty of a war in which she never chose to fight. Her every agonizing step was a reminder that a god's love could be a fate far worse than death itself. Not all divine love was born of Zeus's wandering eye. Sometimes it was born of pride, a festering wound in the heart of a god who thought himself above such trivial things. This was the case for the shining god, Apollo, the master of music, poetry, and reason. You would think that a god of such clarity and light would be immune to foolish passions. But on Olympus, reason was often the first casualty of a bruised ego. Our next story belongs to him, and to a wood nymph named Daphne. She was a wild spirit of the forest, a daughter of a river god, and wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Like the goddess Artemis, whom she so admired, Daphne had sworn herself to the wilderness and to a life of eternal chastity. She found her joy not in the arms of a lover, but in the freedom of the hunt, her hair unbound, running with the wind through the trees. Her father often despaired, wishing for grandchildren, but she would plead with him to let her remain unmarried, to grant her the same freedom that Artemis enjoyed. And he, loving her, had agreed. The tragedy began, as it so often did, with a moment of divine arrogance. Apollo, fresh from a great victory where he had slain the monstrous serpent Python with his silver bow, was feeling particularly pleased with himself. He saw the young god of love, Eros, casually playing with his own small bow and arrows. And Apollo, filled with hubris, laughed. "What is a boy like you doing with a warrior's weapon?" he mocked, his voice echoing with condescension. "Leave such things to me. Your arrows are for simple games. Mine are for felling great beasts." "Arrows," known to the Romans as Cupid, was not amused. He was often depicted as a cherubic child, but his power was anything but childlike. His arrows, though small, held a force that could humble the greatest of gods. They did not just pierce flesh, they commanded hearts, twisting fates and toppling empires with a single, silent shot. He looked up at the radiant sun god and decided to teach him a lesson in respect he would never forget. From his quiver, Eros drew 2 arrows, each with a very different purpose. One was tipped with shining gold, sharp and exquisitely crafted. It was an arrow that, upon striking a heart, would ignite an all-consuming, obsessive love. The other was blunt, its tip made of dull, heavy lead. It was an arrow that filled a soul with disgust and revulsion, making the very thought of romance unbearable. With a faint, cruel smile, Eros flew to the top of a mountain. He aimed the golden arrow and fired it with perfect precision, straight into Apollo's heart. Then he turned his bow towards the forest where Daphne was hunting, and with the same unerring aim, he shot her with the arrow of lead. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Apollo looked upon Daphne and was consumed by a love so fierce it bordered on madness. Every rational thought vanished, replaced by an overwhelming need to possess her. All he saw was the most beautiful creature he had ever laid eyes on. At the same moment, Daphne caught sight of Apollo, and her heart was filled with nothing but a deep, unshakable dread. The god of healing was now incurably sick with love, and the free-spirited nymph was now the unwilling prey in a hunt from which there was no escape. And so the chase began. It was not a hunt for sport, but a desperate flight from a love that felt like a predator's grasp. Through the forests and fields, Daphne ran, her heart pounding with a terror that drowned out all other sound. She was swift, a child of the wilderness, but he was a god. With every step she took, he gained. He called out to her, his pleas a mixture of love and frustration, promising he meant no harm, that he was the great god Apollo, not some rough shepherd. But his words only terrified her more. Her lungs burned, her legs grew heavy with exhaustion. The forest that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a labyrinth with no exit. She could feel his breath on the back of her neck, his divine presence a suffocating heat. The chase was almost over. She reached the banks of her father's river, the cool water swirling around her ankles, and with her last ounce of strength, she cried out. It was not a prayer to Apollo, but to her father, the river god, Peneus. "Father, help me," she screamed, her voice breaking with despair. "If your waters hold power, then destroy the beauty that has brought me this suffering. Change my form, free me." Her prayer was answered instantly. A strange, heavy numbness seized her limbs. Her feet, so swift just moments before, began to feel rooted to the soft, wet earth. A thin, rough bark crept up her skin, enveloping her smooth legs and torso. Her arms, which she had raised in her plea, stretched and stiffened into long, twisting branches. Her hair, flowing behind her in the wind, sprouted and thickened into a dense canopy of green leaves. She had been saved. She had been erased. Apollo finally reached her, his arms outstretched to embrace her. But he was too late. He wrapped his arms not around the warm, breathing nymph he loved, but around the cold, unyielding trunk of a newly formed tree. He could still feel her heart beating faintly beneath the wood, a fading pulse of the life he had extinguished with his passion. Tears streamed down the face of the sun god as he pressed his lips to the bark. "Since you can no longer be my bride," he whispered to the rustling leaves, his voice thick with sorrow and a chilling possessiveness, "you will be my sacred tree. My lyre and my quiver will be adorned with your branches. Your leaves will crown the heads of heroes, of poets, and of victors at the games. You will be evergreen, a symbol of my eternal grief and glory." And this was his final, selfish act. Even in her escape, he claimed her. Daphne won her freedom from his pursuit, but at the cost of her very self. Her transformation was not a victory. It was a surrender into silence. She was finally safe from him, but she was also gone. And the great honor he bestowed upon her, the laurel wreath, was just a beautiful name for a cage made of bark and leaves. It was a permanent, public brand of his ownership, a constant reminder of a love that was so absolute, it refused to ever truly let her go. You might think that the danger in a god's love lies only in its imbalance in the chase, the rejection, the unwanted pursuit. But what happens when that love is returned, when a mortal gazes upon a god not with fear, but with genuine affection? Surely, then, they are safe. Surely, then, the story can end in peace. The tale of Hyacinthus, however, teaches us a more somber lesson, that even a requited divine love can be a death sentence. Hyacinthus was a prince of Sparta, a youth of such remarkable beauty and grace that he captured the hearts of not one, but two deities, Apollo, the radiant god of the sun, and Zephyrus, the gentle god of the west wind. But it was Apollo whom Hyacinthus admired, and the feeling was mutual. Unlike our previous tales, their connection was not a story of possession, but of shared joy. It was, perhaps, one of the most sincere and gentle relationships Apollo ever had. They would leave the divine halls of Olympus and the mortal palaces of Sparta behind to spend their days in the quiet company of nature. They hunted together in the woods, their laughter echoing through the trees. Apollo would teach the young prince to play the lyre, his divine music filling the air. And they would compete in sport, challenging each other in friendly contests of strength and skill. For a time, it seemed that a god and a mortal could, in fact, find simple happiness together. But this shared affection was watched from afar with a burning envy. Zephyrus, the west wind, also loved the young prince, and his heart grew bitter seeing Hyacinthus choose Apollo over him. The wind god was a being of impulse and gusting emotion, and his jealousy began to fester, waiting for a chance to intervene. That chance came on a bright, clear afternoon. Apollo and Hyacinthus were in an open field, taking turns throwing the discus. They were laughing, their faces flushed with sun and exertion. Apollo, wishing to display his divine strength for the youth he adored, took his turn. He hurled the heavy bronze disc high into the air, a perfect spinning arc against the brilliant blue sky. Hyacinthus, eager to impress the god in return, ran to catch it, his eyes fixed on its descent. It was in that moment that Zephyrus saw his opportunity. In a fit of jealous rage, he blew a sudden, vicious gust of wind. It was not a gentle breeze, but a sharp, invisible hand that struck the discus in midair, altering its path. The heavy bronze plate veered sideways with terrible speed and struck Hyacinthus squarely on the temple. The young prince collapsed to the ground without a sound, a splash of crimson blooming in the green grass. His life was extinguished in an instant. The game was over. Apollo cried out at a sound of pure agony that silenced the birds in the trees and stilled the wind. He rushed to the fallen prince, gathering his limp body into his arms. He, the god of healing, the one who could mend the most grievous wounds and cure plagues with a touch, was utterly helpless. He held the dying boy, trying to staunch the flow of blood, whispering desperate pleas. But it was useless. The life was already fading from Hyacinthus's eyes, and soon he was gone. In his grief, Apollo raged. He raged at his own immortality, wishing he could follow the boy into the quiet darkness of death. He raged at the discus, the sport, the cruel twist of fate. And in his sorrow, he refused to let Hades claim Hyacinthus's soul for the underworld. He would not let the boy he loved become just another pale, wandering shade. He held the body close, and where the prince's dark blood had stained the green earth, a new flower began to grow. It pushed up from the soil, a beautiful, slender bloom of deep, royal purple. This was the hyacinth, born from a god's grief and a mortal's blood. And if you looked closely at its delicate petals, the legend says you could see the markings of the god's sorrow, the Greek letters Ai, the sound of a heartbroken cry, forever etched into the fabric of the natural world. And so, Hyacinthus was given a different kind of immortality, not of life, but of memory, a beautiful flower that would bloom each spring, a fragile reminder of a love that was pure, and a jealousy that was fatal. Apollo established a festival in his honor, the Hyacinthiae, a solemn rite in Sparta that mourned his death for 3 days before celebrating his life. But it was a hollow comfort. It sucked to be Hyacinthus, because his story proves that even when a god's love is true, it makes you a target. He was not killed by his lover's cruelty or carelessness, but by another god's envy. He was a casualty in a game he didn't even know he was playing, a fragile human caught in the devastating crossfire of divine passions. His story is perhaps the most heartbreaking of all, for it shows that even in the best, most sincere circumstances, a mortal loved by a god is never, ever truly safe. Their powerful emotions, even their love, create ripples that can drown the very people they cherish most. We have seen how a god's love can burn, deform, and kill by accident. But we now turn to a story of a love that was a trial from its very first breath. A love born not from a god's desire, but from a goddess's hatred. This is the story of Psyche. She was the youngest of 3 princesses, but her beauty was so extraordinary it seemed to belong to another world. Before Psyche was even old enough to understand the word goddess, she was being compared to one. By the time she reached womanhood, her fame had spread so far and wide that the temples of Aphrodite herself began to gather dust. Mortals would travel for miles, not to worship at the altar of the true goddess of love, but simply to glimpse the face of this mortal girl. People whispered that she must be divine, that no mortal woman could look like that by accident, and they began to treat her as if she were Aphrodite reincarnated in flesh and bone. But for Psyche, all this reverence felt hollow. She walked through the adoring crowds like a phantom, celebrated but utterly alone. Her two older sisters had married noble men and started families, living the kind of warm, grounded lives that Psyche herself craved. But no suitor would dare to court a girl believed to be a rival of Aphrodite. Men looked at her as if she were a living painting, flawless, silent, and untouchable. Her beauty had become a curse, a shimmering wall that distanced her from the only thing she truly wanted: a soul that saw her, not just her face. She would stand by her window at dusk, watching the horizon fade, and wonder if this was her fate, to be loved by all, but held by none. This misplaced worship, however, did not go unnoticed. High on Mount Olympus, where beauty was more than vanity, it was power, Aphrodite watched. She saw her temples grow silent, her altars grow cold. She saw mortals laying garlands at the feet of a mere girl, and her divine envy began to twist into a cold and burning rage. To her, Psyche wasn't a beautiful child. She was an insult carved into flesh, a living act of treason against her divine authority. And so, the goddess of love, who had destroyed kings for far lesser offenses, decided to act. Psyche's life was about to be ruined, not because she had done anything wrong, but simply because she was too beautiful to be ignored. Now, her son was Eros, the god of love. But this was not the soft, tender love that mortals wrote poems about. No, Eros dealt in a more primal force. He was the god of overwhelming passion, of desire so intense it bordered on madness. He sparked passion where there should be none. He made kings fall for swindlers and queens for slaves. His arrows didn't ask for permission. They shattered logic, loyalty, and sometimes entire empires. He was a weapon, and his mother now aimed him at the heart of a mortal girl. Aphrodite's command was simple and cruel. She ordered Eros to find Psyche and use his power to make her fall in love with the most hideous, vile, and wretched creature on earth. She wanted Psyche's beauty to be bound to something monstrous, her life ruined by a grotesque love that would make her an object of pity and scorn for all time. Let her feel what it's like to be mocked by love, the goddess thought. Eros, ever the obedient son, accepted the mission. With his bow slung over his back and a quiver full of divine arrows, he descended to the mortal realm under the cover of moonlight. He found Psyche asleep in her chamber, the soft candlelight flickering across her features. She was even more beautiful than the stories had described. And Eros, who had pierced 1,000 hearts without a second thought, felt his own skip a beat. This wasn't part of the plan. He was a god, a force of nature, not a spectator. Still, he reached for an arrow, ready to carry out his mother's vicious command. But in his distraction, in that brief moment of awe, something went wrong. His hand slipped. The razor-sharp tip of his own arrow pricked his skin. It was just a scratch, just a single drop of divine blood. But it was enough. The god of love had just fallen victim to his own power. And in that one silent, fateful moment, the entire course of the tragedy shifted. The passion his arrow was meant to create now flooded his own immortal heart. He looked at the sleeping girl not as a target, but as the center of his entire universe. He would no longer be his mother's weapon. He would be Psyche's secret protector. He vanished before she could stir, the wound from his own arrow still warm on his skin. But neither of them knew what price the gods would demand for this forbidden affection. And they did not know that Aphrodite, queen of beauty and mother of love, would never forgive betrayal. Eros vanished from Psyche's chamber, but his love now acted as an invisible shield. He kept her protected from his mother's command by ensuring no suitor, hideous or otherwise, could ever reach her. To the outside world, however, Psyche's life grew stranger by the day. Her beauty, once a spectacle, now seemed cursed. No man dared to ask for her hand. While her sisters enjoyed their lives, she remained alone in her father's palace. Her father, desperate and afraid that he had angered the gods, consulted the oracle of Apollo. The words that returned were not a comfort, but a cruel and public sentence. The oracle declared that Psyche would not wed a mortal man. Instead, she was destined to marry a monster, a beast so terrible that even the gods themselves feared him. Her family was commanded to dress her in funeral-like wedding clothes, lead her in a sorrowful procession to the highest mountaintop, and leave her there to meet her fate. Her family wept, their hearts broken by the brutal prophecy. But Psyche, oddly calm, stood with a quiet resignation. She had been adored like a goddess, yet had never been touched by human love. Perhaps this monstrous fate was simply the balance for her unnatural beauty. She agreed to go, not out of courage, but out of a deep weariness. Her life had never felt like her own, and she surrendered to this final, terrible chapter. She was left alone on the cold, windswept peak. She closed her eyes, bracing for the roar of a beast, for sharp claws and gnashing teeth. But what came was not a monster. It was a gentle breeze, the west wind, Zephyrus, sent by a loving Eros, lifted her softly from the ground. It was a touch as gentle as a sigh, and it carried her away from the mountain of her sacrifice, over valleys and fields, and set her down in a meadow of impossible, glowing flowers. Before her stood a palace, grander than anything human hands could build, its pillars shimmering like moonlight on water. Its halls seemed to whisper her name without a sound. Hesitantly, she stepped through the threshold, expecting fear but finding only a profound and surreal peace. This was her new home, and it was a place of magic. Invisible servants tended to her every need. Hands she couldn't see washed her feet. Voices she couldn't place guided her through rooms filled with treasures. A magnificent feast appeared on the table, warm and fragrant, though no one had said it. This was Eros's desperate, secret plan. He would take her, not as a monster, but as a shadow. He would love her in this hidden palace, this gilded cage, where she would be safe from his mother's wrath. But his protection came with a strict and mysterious condition. He would visit her only in the pitch darkness of night, and she must never, ever try to look upon his face. And so, Psyche's new life began. It was a life of strange and beautiful contradictions. Her nights were filled with a love unlike any she had ever imagined. The voice of her husband was deep and tender. His touch in the darkness was like a dream. She was falling fast in love with a man she had never seen. And in the darkness, she felt truly known. But each morning, he was gone before the first hint of dawn, leaving her to wander the silent, empty paradise alone. Though she had every luxury she could imagine, she was isolated. The loneliness began to weigh on her, a quiet ache in the midst of all her comfort. She missed her family. Then, one night, Her husband's voice was different, laced with sorrow. He warned her that her sisters, believing her to be dead, were coming to the mountain top to mourn for her. Sorrow will follow if you see them, he said. They believe they come out of love, but what they bring is ruin. But Psyche wept. Her sisters were her last connection to the world she had lost, to the girl she used to be. She pleaded with him to let her see them, just once. Eros, who could never deny her, hesitated, but finally agreed, with one solemn warning: do not let their words poison what we have. They will try to unravel your trust. You must not listen. And so the west wind carried her sisters to the garden gates of the invisible palace. When they saw Psyche, they were stunned. She was not dead, but radiant, draped in silks finer than any queen, her skin glowing like starlight. They embraced her, their laughter brittle, hiding the sharp, sudden sting of envy that pierced their hearts. They toured the magnificent palace, their awe quickly souring into jealousy. "Where is your husband?" one of them asked, her eyes scanning the empty halls. Psyche, trying to be loyal, simply said that he was a handsome young man who was away on a hunting trip. But later, under their sharp questioning, she grew flustered and admitted he was a wealthy merchant who was traveling. Her conflicting stories gave them the opening they needed. They saw her unease and they pounced. "You've never seen him," one gasped, feigning shock. "He won't let you see his face." The other pressed, her voice dripping with sweet, false concern. Psyche. What if the oracle was right? What if he is a monster? A hideous beast who waits for you to grow plump before he devours you. Why else would he hide in the darkness? The words, born of pure jealousy, were sharpened to a point and aimed directly at Psyche's deepest fear. The seed of doubt was planted. As they left, they kissed her cheeks and whispered their final, poisonous advice. Take a lamp tonight and a sharp knife. When he is asleep, look at him. If he is the monster, you must be brave and cut off his head. But if he is not, what harm can a little truth do? Psyche watched them disappear, and for the first time since arriving in paradise, she couldn't stop shaking, not from fear of a monster, but from a terrible, consuming curiosity. That night, Psyche could not sleep. She lay in the darkness, wrapped in silk sheets, his arms gently curled around her, his breath steady and calm beside hers. But her mind was a storm. Her sister's words echoed like a cruel spell. What if he's a monster? What if he's using you? She had trusted him blindly, given herself completely to a voice in the dark. But was that love? Or was it simply a beautiful surrender? The need to know, the seed of doubt her sisters had so expertly planted, had now taken root and was choking her. She slipped from the bed, silent as snowfall. Her bare feet kissed the cold floor as she retrieved the items her sisters had suggested: a small bronze oil lamp, which she carefully lit, and a sharp knife, its edge glinting in the flickering flame. Her heart thundered in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the palace. She crept back to the bed, her fingers trembling as she raised the lamp to finally look upon the face of her husband. And when the warm, gentle light reached his face, she gasped. Not a monster, not a beast. It was a man, more beautiful than any words could describe. Golden curls were tangled on the pillow. His soft lips were curved in sleep, and on his back, two magnificent wings, feathered and divine, were folded like a precious secret. It was Eros, the god of love himself. He had chosen her. Her eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from a wave of overwhelming relief and crushing guilt. He had trusted her, warned her, loved her, and she had doubted him. She had stood over him with a knife in her hand. She leaned closer, wanting to kiss his lips, to whisper an apology before the light was gone. But fate, as it so often is cruel. As she leaned, her hand trembled, and a single drop of searing hot oil spilled from the lamp, landing on his bare shoulder. Eros awoke with a cry, not of anger, but of pure pain and betrayal. His eyes, wide with heartbreak, met hers. "You broke your promise," he said, his voice hollowed out by sorrow. "Love cannot live where there is no trust." And with that, he rose into the air, his wings carrying him away into the darkness. As he vanished, the magical world they had shared unraveled like smoke. The palace, the gardens, the enchanted feast, all of it crumbled into nothing. Psyche was left alone, kneeling on a barren, empty hillside, the warm lamp still clutched in her hand, her heart completely shattered. She had finally seen the face of the god who loved her, and in that same terrible moment, she had lost him. Psyche wandered barefoot and broken across a world that suddenly seemed colder and harsher than she had ever known. The lush gardens and silken halls of her invisible palace were gone, replaced by thorny wastes and lonely roads. She called out for Eros in forests and fields, but the only reply was the echo of her own sorrowful voice. In her desperation, she realized there was only one path forward. She could not hide. She had to face the source of her suffering directly. She would find Aphrodite, not to beg for mercy, but to offer herself in servitude, to face whatever wrath the goddess might unleash in the faint hope of earning back the love she had lost. She found Aphrodite in a golden temple, her beauty as sharp and unforgiving as blades of glass. The goddess met Psyche's plea, not with pity, but with a cold, cruel smile. "So, the mortal girl who betrayed my son comes crawling back," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You wish to prove you are worthy of him, then you will be tested. You will suffer. And perhaps, at the very end of your agony, you will be worthy." For the first task, Aphrodite led Psyche to a vast, dim storage chamber. Inside, mountains of seeds were spilled across the floor: barley, millet, lentils, poppy seeds, wheat, and beans, all mixed together into an indistinguishable, chaotic mound. By nightfall, Aphrodite said, with a dismissive yawn, "Separate them. Every grain, every seed, into its proper pile. If you fail, you will never see my son again." And then she left, humming to herself. Psyche stared at the impossible task. Even 1,000 hands working for 1,000 hours could not sort such a mess in a single day. The sheer hopelessness of it washed over her. She didn't even try to begin. She simply knelt on the cold stone floor and wept in silence. But her quiet despair was witnessed. A tiny ant, seeing the girl's plight, was moved by pity. It was not right that such a love should be met with such cruelty. The ant quickly rallied its colony, and soon a living river of hundreds, then thousands of ants swarmed the chamber. With a shocking, single-minded precision, they formed lines, dividing the seeds. One line carried barley, another millet, another lentils, each tiny creature doing its part. In a matter of hours, The mountain of chaos had been transformed into neat, perfect pyramids of sorted grain. When Aphrodite returned at dusk, expecting to see Psyche weeping in failure, she was met with the sight of perfect order. She stopped, stunned. Her lips twitched with anger. "This was not your work," she snapped. "You had help." Psyche simply bowed her head, saying nothing. No matter. This was only the beginning. The goddess's smile returned, colder than before. There were still many more trials to come, each one harder and deadlier than the last. Psyche barely had time to rest before Aphrodite handed her the second task, this one even crueler in its design. The goddess pointed to a distant meadow shimmering beside a river. "See those rams grazing there?" she asked, her voice deceptively sweet. "Their wool is made of pure gold. Bring me a tuft of it, just a handful. But do try not to die," she added with a smirk, and vanished. Psyche made her way to the field and saw that this was no simple chore. These were no gentle creatures. The golden rams were savage and wild, known to gore and tear apart any intruder who dared to enter their territory during the day. Their horns were sharp as spears, and their eyes burned with rage. There was no way she could survive. She sank to her knees by the river bank, tears of despair welling in her eyes, ready to give up. But once again, the world seemed to watch with pity. A soft whisper drifted through the tall grass at the river's edge. It was the voice of a reed, a quiet spirit of the water. "Do not enter the field while the sun is high," the spirit murmured. "The rams are filled with rage under the daylight, but when twilight falls, they rest in the shade. Wait until then. Gather the golden wool that has been snagged on the thorny branches of the thicket. No beast will miss it." Psyche did as the quiet voice advised. She waited patiently for dusk, and when the rams were asleep, she crept forward and carefully gathered the shimmering tufts of golden fleece from the brambles. She returned to Aphrodite, who took the wool with a look of pure frustration. "You live again," the goddess muttered. Curious, Aphrodite was growing desperate. For the third trial, she gave Psyche an errand that should have ended her story for good. She handed the girl a crystal vial and commanded her to fetch water, not from a well or a stream, but from the river Styx itself. Psyche's blood ran cold. The Styx was no ordinary river. It marked the terrifying boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Its black waters were cursed, fatal to any mortal who touched them. Her journey led her to the edge of a cliff so steep it seemed carved by the hands of titans, and far below, the river churned. Worse still, guarding the falls were monstrous winged beings, sentinels of the underworld who shrieked and swooped at anything that moved. There was no path down, no way forward. This was the end. She collapsed, clutching the vial, her body numb with the certainty of failure. But then a shadow fell over her. From high above, a great eagle, the sacred bird of Zeus himself, soared down. Perhaps Eros had once helped the king of the gods, and this was a debt being repaid. The eagle, without a word, gently took the crystal vial from Psyche's trembling hand. It spread its massive wings and plunged down the deadly cliff, expertly dodging the shrieking guardians. Within moments, it returned, placing the sealed vial, now filled with the shimmering, cursed water of the Styx, safely back into her hands. When Psyche presented it to Aphrodite, the goddess accepted it with stony silence. Psyche had passed again, but the final trial would take her where even gods feared to go, into the underworld itself. Aphrodite's voice was colder than the river Styx itself. She had thrown impossible tasks at this mortal girl. And somehow, Psyche had survived. Now, there was only one place left to send her, a place from which no mortal returns. For your final task, the goddess said, her voice devoid of all emotion, you will journey to the realm of Hades. There, you will find Queen Persephone and beg her for a small portion of her beauty. Place it in this box, she said, handing Psyche a small, plain, sealed container. Tell her I need it. Your existence exhausts me. It was a death sentence. The living did not simply walk into the underworld and return, but Psyche, no longer hesitating, accepted her fate. If the path to Eros lay through darkness, then she would walk it. Guided by sympathetic whispers, some say from a talking tower she was about to throw herself from, she learned the secret rules of passage. She brought with her 2 coins for Charon, the silent ferryman of the dead, and 2 barley cakes to pacify Cerberus, the 3-headed hound who guarded the gates of Hades. Every step deeper into the earth drained the warmth from her bones. The air grew thick, not with smoke, but with a profound and heavy silence. The pale, drifting shades of the dead passed her like memories, their forms thin and hollow. At the river Acheron, Charon accepted his coin and rowed her through still, black waters stained with forgotten grief. When Cerberus appeared at the threshold of Persephone's palace, snarling and blocking her path, she fed him the honeyed cakes, and he quieted, allowing her to pass. Inside, Persephone sat serene on her obsidian throne, her eyes like polished garnets. You come for beauty, the Queen of the Dead said, her voice not unkindly. But at what cost? Psyche explained her task, and Persephone, who perhaps understood the madness of love better than any other goddess, nodded. She took the box, disappeared for a moment, and returned, handing the sealed container back to Psyche. Do not open it, the queen warned. It is not meant for your eyes. Psyche thanked her and began the long journey back to the world of the living. The journey was quiet, but heavier now with the weight of temptation. The box pulsed in her hands. Surely, she thought, just a peek couldn't hurt. Doubt, her old enemy, crept back into her mind. What if this divine beauty could make me worthy of Eros again? As she finally saw the light of the mortal world ahead, her heart raced, her fingers twitched, and her curiosity overwhelmed her. For the first time in all her trials, she made a mistake. She opened the box, and darkness consumed her. It wasn't beauty inside. It wasn't divine radiance. It was sleep. Not ordinary sleep, but the deathless, Stygian slumber of the deep underworld, a piece of the eternal void. Psyche didn't scream or collapse. She simply dropped. Her body fell softly onto the grass at the very edge of the mortal world, caught in an eternal pause, her heart stilled by her own curiosity. And that might have been the end of Psyche, a tragic monument to her own curiosity, frozen forever at the edge of the living world. But love, true love, has a way of surviving even the sleep of death. Far away in Olympus, Eros had not forgotten her. His wound from the hot oil had long since healed, but his heart had not. He had kept away at his mother's command, tormented by visions of Psyche toiling through one impossible trial after another. He had witnessed her courage, her endurance, and her unwavering devotion. When he felt her presence vanish into that deathless slumber, he knew she had done it all for him, and he could bear his silent, gilded prison no longer. Defying Aphrodite, he burst from the halls of Olympus in a blaze of golden wings, the clouds splitting at his heels. He raced through the skies until he found her, lying motionless and silent, a perfect marble statue kissed by the dusk. He fell to his knees beside her and wept, not tears of sorrow, but of rage, of regret, and of a love too big for words. He gently lifted the box from her side and sealed it shut, containing the dangerous sleep once more. Then, without hesitation, he leaned down and kissed her lips. It was not a magical kiss that broke his spell. It was simpler and more profound than that. It was a promise, a memory, a desperate plea for her to return. And it was enough. Her eyes fluttered open. The Stygian sleep lifted from her mind like a fog, and the first thing she saw was his face, no longer hidden by darkness. Her hands reached for him before she could even speak. "Eros?" she breathed, her voice a fragile whisper. "You came back." "I never stopped loving you," he whispered, holding her tighter than ever before. And in that moment, all the gods who had watched from above, some amused, some angered, finally understood. The great and chaotic god of love had met his match, not in another deity, but in the enduring, unbreakable heart of a mortal girl who had walked through hell itself to find him. Their reunion, on that lonely hillside, shook the foundations of Olympus. A god had defied his mother for a mortal. A mortal had walked through the underworld and returned. Such love was dangerous. It was an unpredictable force that upset the very order of things. Eros, no longer willing to hide, knew there was only one path forward. He took Psyche's hand, and together they flew straight to the gleaming halls of Mount Olympus to face the judgment of Zeus himself. Aphrodite was livid. She stormed into the court of the gods, her beauty radiating a cold fury. "This mortal," she cried, her voice echoing through the grand hall, "has mocked the gods, meddled with sacred laws, and corrupted my son. She has defied me, and she must be erased." But the other gods were no longer so certain. They had watched Psyche's trials from above. They had seen her sort the endless seeds, face the golden rams, and descend into the darkness of the underworld. They had witnessed her suffer, persevere, and rise again. Her love had survived what no mortal love ever had. There was a quiet murmur among the Olympians, a grudging respect for the girl who should have been broken. And so they all turned to Zeus. The king of the gods sat silent on his throne, a thunderbolt resting in one hand, the fate of the world in the other. He had watched all of it, from Psyche's fall to her rise, from her moment of doubt to her unwavering devotion. He saw the whole story, not just his daughter's wounded pride. At last he spoke, his voice the sound of shifting mountains. "There is power," Zeus said, his gaze fixed on Aphrodite, "in a love that endures." Aphrodite opened her mouth to protest, but he raised a hand, and the goddess of love fell silent. "You have tested her," he continued, his voice resonating with finality, "and she has passed. more than any mortal I have ever seen. She is not unworthy of Olympus. She is proof that even mortals can love like gods." He then turned to Eros and Psyche, who stood trembling before him. "You wish to be together, truly and forever?" he asked. They both nodded, their hands clasped tightly together. "Then so be it." With a flick of his hand, Zeus summoned a golden goblet. It was filled with ambrosia, the shimmering, honeyed nectar of the gods. He offered it to Psyche. "Drink this," the king of the gods said, his voice softer now, "and you will no longer be mortal. Your heart will beat with the pulse of eternity, and your soul will live among us. But your trials will not be erased. You will carry them, as we all carry the stories that shape us." Psyche took the goblet. Her hands, this time, did not tremble. She looked at Eros, who nodded with a love that filled her with strength. She drank. A warmth spread through her, not burning like Zeus's glory, but blooming, like a flower turning to the sun. Her senses expanded. Her mortal fragility fell away, replaced by a quiet, enduring radiance. And just like that, she was divine, no longer Psyche the mortal, but Psyche the immortal, a goddess in her own right. Even Aphrodite, who had once cursed her, had to accept what stood before her now. Her son's wife was no longer a rival, but an equal. A great feast was held on Olympus. Nectar flowed like rivers, and the stars seemed to dance in celebration. Eros and Psyche, the god of love and the new goddess of the soul, were finally, truly united. And from their union, a daughter was eventually born, Hedone, the personification of pleasure and delight, a symbol of the joy that is born from the marriage of love and the soul. It is a beautiful ending to a harrowing story. But as we leave them to their immortal happiness, we must not forget the cost. It sucked to be Psyche, because her happiness was forged in the fires of a goddess's jealousy and the crucible of impossible trials. She had to be abandoned, betrayed, and sent to the literal underworld, all because she was beautiful enough to be noticed by one god and loved by another. Her immortality was not a gift. It was a reward for a level of suffering no mortal should ever have to endure. Her story, in the end, is the ultimate testament to why a god's love was so often a curse, because even when it ended in heaven, the path to get there was always through hell. Psyche's tale, for all its pain, ended in divinity. But for most mortals touched by a god's love, there was no ambrosia waiting at the end of their suffering, only a colder, lonelier fate. Our path now leads us away from the court of Olympus and deep into the untamed forests of Arcadia, where our next story unfolds. Here lived a nymph named Callisto. She was a daughter of the wilderness, and her heart belonged to one goddess alone, Artemis, the virgin huntress. Callisto was not just a follower. She was one of Artemis's most cherished hunting companions. Together, they would track stags through ancient woods, their laughter the only sound to break the stillness. They would rest by cool, clear streams and share quiet stories under the moonlight. Like her goddess, Callisto had taken a vow of eternal chastity, not as a sacrifice, but as a joyful pledge to the independent, untamed life she loved. She wanted no part in the world of men or the messy, unpredictable passions of the gods. Her life was one of clean air, sharp arrows, and the loyal companionship of the goddess she revered. She was happy. She was content. And that, it seems, was a thing that could not be left in peace. From his throne on high, Zeus watched her. He was captivated by her wild grace, a beauty that wasn't polished or courtly, but raw and free like the forest she called home. He desired her, but he also saw her fierce devotion to Artemis. He knew that unlike so many others, Callisto could not be wooed with promises of power or overwhelmed by a show of force. Her loyalty to the virgin goddess was absolute, a shield around her heart that he could not break through by conventional means. And so, the king of the gods, rather than honoring her devotion or simply leaving her to her peaceful existence, decided on a plan of profound and cruel deception. If he could not have her as Zeus, he would come to her as someone she could never refuse. The only way to possess her was to defile the very thing she held most sacred, her trust in the goddess she loved. He would not just take her body, he would shatter her world. One day, as Callisto was resting from the hunt in a quiet, shaded grove, she saw her goddess approaching through the trees. Her heart lifted. It was Artemis, but it wasn't. It was Zeus, wearing the face and form of the huntress like a mask, his every movement a perfect imitation of the goddess she adored. He smiled at Callisto, a warm, affectionate smile, and she, suspecting nothing, smiled back. The false Artemis sat beside her, speaking of the day's hunt, her voice a perfect echo of the real goddesses. Then, with a tenderness that was perhaps slightly out of character for the usually reserved huntress, the figure opened her arms for an embrace. Callisto, without a moment's hesitation, stepped into them. She felt safe. She felt cherished. And it was in this moment of perfect trust, this moment of complete vulnerability, that the trap was sprung. Zeus revealed his true form. The familiar, comforting presence of her mistress was gone, replaced by the overwhelming, terrifying power of the king of the gods. And there, in the sacred quiet of the forest she called home, in the sanctuary she believed was safe, he violated her. He shattered her vows, her spirit, and her faith in a single, brutal act. When it was over, he was gone, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. He left behind no trace of his presence, except a broken nymph curled on the forest floor, the silence of the grove now feeling like an accusation. The world she had known, a world of clean lines, of clear purpose, of loyalty and honor, was gone. It had been a lie. The love of Zeus had not come to her as a storm she could see and flee from, but as a poison disguised as comfort. He had not only taken her body, he had taken her faith. He had used her pure devotion to Artemis as a key to unlock her defenses, and in doing so, had destroyed everything she believed in. She could not tell Artemis. How could she explain what had happened? How could she face the virgin goddess? Her body, now a testament to a violation that had broken the most sacred vow she had ever made. And so, Callisto carried her shame and her sorrow in silence, hiding her growing belly and her broken heart from the very companions she had once laughed with, a lonely, isolated figure in the midst of the life she had once loved. For months, Callisto managed to hide her secret. She wore looser tunics and kept to the shadows at the edge of the hunting party. Her easy laughter grew rare, and a quiet, sorrowful distance formed between her and the other nymphs. She was a ghost haunting the edges of the life she once loved, terrified of the truth coming out, but even more terrified of the life growing inside her. Artemis, wrapped up in the freedom of the hunt and the wild, did not seem to notice at first. But the other nymphs whispered among themselves, sensing the change in their companion, her sadness a palpable thing. The truth, as it always does, came to light in the most ordinary of ways. One hot afternoon, after a long and successful hunt, Artemis suggested they all bathe in a cool, clear stream to refresh themselves. It was a simple, joyful suggestion, an innocent moment of camaraderie. But for Callisto, it was a sentence. She held back, making excuses, her face pale with dread. But the goddess insisted, her voice still light and friendly, but with an underlying edge of command that could not be refused. Reluctantly, with trembling hands, Callisto disrobed, and her secret was revealed to all. The gentle curve of her belly was undeniable proof that her sacred vow of chastity had been broken. A shocked silence fell over the stream, broken only by the gentle sound of flowing water. The nymphs stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and accusation. And Artemis, the goddess Callisto, had loved. The one she had devoted her entire life to, her expression hardened. It shifted from confusion to disappointment, and then to a cold, unforgiving fury. In Artemis's eyes, the story did not matter. She did not ask for an explanation. She did not see a victim of her own father's lust. She saw only a broken promise, a stain on the purity of her sacred band of followers, a betrayal of the ideal they all lived by. "Begone!" the goddess commanded, her voice like ice, stripping Callisto of her place and her identity with two simple words. "You have no place here. You have defiled our sisterhood." And so Callisto was cast out. She was driven from the forest that had been her home, shunned by the nymphs who had been her sisters, and abandoned by the goddess who had been her entire world. She was left utterly alone, pregnant and disgraced, to wander the wilderness with no one to turn to. The love of Zeus had not only cost her her innocence, it had cost her everything and everyone she had ever held dear. But Callisto's suffering was not over. Banishment, it seemed, was not enough for the gods. Alone in the wilderness, she gave birth to a son, whom she named Arcas. For a brief time, perhaps, there was a sliver of joy in her lonely existence as she cared for her child. But Hera was watching. The queen of the gods was not satisfied with Callisto's disgrace. She wanted her very humanity erased. Hera descended upon the new mother, her face a mask of cold fury. With a touch born of pure venom, she transformed the former nymph. Callisto fell to her hands and knees as coarse. Dark fur sprouted from her skin. Her gentle hands twisted into paws armed with sharp claws. Her voice, which once called out in prayer to Artemis, was replaced by a guttural, angry roar. She was now a bear, but inside this terrifying new form, her human mind, her memories, her love for her son, and her overwhelming grief all remained, trapped and screaming in silence. She fled into the deep woods, now fearing the hunters she once ran alongside. She was a mother trapped in the body of a predator, an outcast from every world. Years passed. Her son, Arcas, was found and raised by others, growing into a mighty hunter, knowing nothing of the great bear, who sometimes watched him from a distance with sad, strangely human eyes. One day, fate engineered a final, terrible meeting. Arcas was hunting in the very forest where his mother now roamed. He came face to face with a great bear. It was Callisto. She recognized her son, now a grown man, and in that moment, her mother's heart forgot the beast's body. She stood on her hind legs, a gesture of recognition, intending to embrace the child she had lost. But Arcas saw only a massive bear rising up to attack him. He raised his hunting spear, taking aim, ready to strike the fatal blow, unknowing that he was about to kill his own mother. In that final, terrible second, as the spear was about to fly, Zeus finally intervened from on high. Unwilling to allow such a matricide to stain the earth, he sent a whirlwind that snatched them both from the ground. He cast them into their heavens, transforming them into eternal patterns of light. Callisto became the constellation Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and her son Arcas became Ursa Minor, the Little Bear. And so they remain, forever circling the North Star. This was not a rescue. It was a sentence. Callisto was made immortal, yes, but as a silent, cold arrangement of stars, forever near the sun she can never speak to, forever fleeing across the night sky. Her story became a perpetual reminder that a god's fleeting desire could result in an eternal, lonely price that a mortal would pay, long after the god himself had moved on. We have seen a god's love as a fire that consumes, a cage that deforms, and a betrayal that isolates. But now we turn to a story where a god's desire was an intrusion so strange, its consequences would ripple outwards to drown an entire civilization in blood and fire. For this, we must travel to Sparta, and to its queen, Leda. She was the wife of the noble King Tyndareus, a respected and virtuous queen. She lived a life of dignity within the high walls of her husband's palace. But her virtue, like the beauty and devotion of the others we have met tonight, did not shield her. Instead, it seemed only to make her a more tempting prize for the king of the gods. Zeus desired her, and to approach the queen, he devised a plan of breathtaking strangeness. He would not come as a man, nor as a storm. He transformed himself into one of the most elegant and graceful of all creatures, a great white swan, its feathers as soft as the clouds of Olympus, its long neck curved in an arc of perfect beauty. He then staged a scene of divine theater. As Leda was walking by a river near the palace, Zeus, in his swan form, flew toward her in a state of apparent panic. He made it seem as though he were being hunted by a predatory eagle soaring high above. The beautiful bird was desperate, seeking refuge, and Leda, a compassionate woman, was the sanctuary it chose. She saw the magnificent creature, terrified and vulnerable, and her heart went out to it. She opened her arms, and the great swan flew into them, hiding its head in the folds of her robes, trembling as if in fear for its life. Leda held the bird close, stroking its soft feathers and murmuring words of comfort, shielding it from the perceived danger in the sky. And in that moment of gentle pity, in that act of kindness, Zeus took advantage of her. The union was sealed, but the threads of fate are rarely simple. On that very same night, Leda also lay with her mortal husband, King Tyndareus. And so, two seeds of life were planted within the queen, one mortal and one divine. This convergence, born from a god's deceptive lust and a queen's mortal duty, would lead to a birth so strange and a legacy so catastrophic. It would change the course of history forever. The love of Zeus. In this quiet, riverside moment, had just doomed the greatest city on earth. The aftermath of Zeus's visit was not a quiet departure, but a legacy that took physical and deeply strange form. In time, Queen Leda gave birth, but not in the ordinary way of mortals. She laid two great eggs. From one egg, hatched from the divine seed of Zeus, emerged two children. The first was a girl of such impossible, luminous beauty that the world itself seemed to hold its breath when she opened her eyes. This was Helen. Beside her was a boy, strong and radiant, with the spark of immortality in his veins. This was Polydeuces, later known to the Romans as Pollux. They were demigods, children of the heavens. From the second egg, hatched from the mortal seed of King Tyndareus, two more children emerged. Another girl, Clytemnestra, her eyes holding a shadow of a different, darker destiny, and a boy, noble and brave but entirely mortal. His life, a fragile flame, next to his half-brother's eternal spark. This was Castor, and so Leda's family was fractured from its very first breath. 4 children, 2 sets of twins, bound by blood but irrevocably separated by fate. 2 were human, destined to live, to love, and to die. 2 were demigods, touched by the power of Olympus, and therefore marked for an extraordinary and tragic future. The 2 brothers, Castor and Pollux, would become inseparable, their story a famous tale of brotherly love, torn apart by mortality. The 2 sisters, Helen and Clytemnestra, would become queens whose names would be forever linked with betrayal, murder, and war. Imagine the queen, Leda, looking at her 4 children. One daughter would one day murder her husband, Agamemnon, upon his return from war. The other would become the reason that war was fought in the first place. One son would be immortal, the other destined to perish. Zeus's brief moment of desire had not just created life. It had woven a web of interlocking, tragic fates that would ensnare not just this family, but all of Greece. Leda's children were no longer just the children of Sparta. They were now characters in a divine drama, their life stories written by a careless god, and their tale would be paid for in blood. The swan's visit was not an act of love. It was the planting of a time bomb in the heart of a mortal kingdom. Of all the children born from that strange union, it was Helen who carried the full, devastating weight of her father's divinity. Her beauty was not just remarkable. It was a force of nature, a power that moved armies and broke kings. It was a beauty that did not truly belong to her, but to the world, and the world would tear itself apart to possess it. She was a living work of art, and like all priceless treasures, she invited theft, conflict, and obsession. Her life was destined to become the focal point of the greatest war in Greek mythology. And it began, as so many tragedies did, with the vanity of the gods. In a divine beauty contest between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, the Trojan prince, Paris, was asked to be the judge. To sway his vote, each goddess offered him a bribe, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, offered him the ultimate prize, the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. She did not ask Helen. She did not consider that Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. She simply offered another woman's life, another woman's destiny, as a token to win an argument over a golden apple. Paris, seduced by the promise, chose Aphrodite, and his judgment led him to Sparta. He was welcomed as a guest, but he left as a thief, taking Helen with him back to the high walls of Troy. That single act, born from a goddess's vanity and a prince's desire, was the spark that ignited a decade of fire and blood. 1,000 ships were launched to bring her back. The greatest heroes of Greece, Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, were called to war, bound by an oath to defend her marriage, an oath made necessary by the very divine beauty that now tore that marriage apart. The war would rage for 10 long, brutal years. The sands of Troy would drink the blood of countless heroes. A great city, rich in culture and history, would be reduced to smoke and memory. And at the center of it all was a face, a beautiful, tragic face that was the living legacy of Zeus's desire. It sucked to be Helen, to be so beautiful that your face was a declaration of war, your existence a funeral pyre for a generation. She was a prize in a game she never asked to play, a symbol for a conflict she had no power to stop. Her life defined not by her choices, but by a beauty that had been cursed upon her by her divine Father. And so we see the full, terrible bloom of a flower planted in a moment of divine lust. The final cost was not paid by Leda, or even by Helen. It was paid by an entire generation of mortals, many of whom had never even heard of the swan or the queen. It sucked not just to be Leda, but to be a soldier from Ithaca, a farmer from Argos, a mother in Troy, or a child who would never meet their father. They all paid the price for Zeus's affair. Think of the heroes who died on those bloody shores. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, felled by an arrow to his only vulnerable spot. The mighty Hector, defender of his city, dragged behind a chariot in disgrace. Noble Patroclus, his life cut short while wearing another man's armor. All dead because a god, long ago, disguised himself as a swan to pursue a woman he would soon forget. Think of the families left behind, the wives who became widows, the children who became orphans. Think of the city of Troy itself, a civilization turned to ash, its people scattered or enslaved. Think of Odysseus, who survived the war only to wander the seas for another 10 years, his men lost, his family believing him dead. All of this suffering, can be traced back to that one moment by the river. This is the ultimate ripple effect of a god's desire. It is never just about two beings. A god's passion is like a great stone dropped into the ocean of humanity. The initial splash is the affair itself, but the tsunami that follows, wiping out cities and reshaping the world, is the true consequence. Leda's story teaches us the most terrifying lesson of all, that when a god decides to love a mortal, the collateral damage can be history itself. The world of men is merely the stage for their grand dramas, and we are all just unnamed characters, destined to be crushed when the scenery inevitably falls. We have explored love that is selfish, accidental, and deceptive. But we now turn to a desire so brutal it cannot even hide behind the word love, a desire so violent that to protect the god who felt it, the story had to transform his victim into a monster. For this, we must travel to a sacred temple on a cliff above the sea and speak of the girl who would become Medusa. Long before she was feared, before statues of heroes froze mid-scream and serpents whispered across marble floors, Medusa was a mortal girl, beautiful beyond compare. Her beauty wasn't loud or proud, it simply existed, uninvited, like sunlight slipping through stone. She was born into a family of monsters, her sisters. Thano and Euryale were immortal gorgons by design, fierce and monstrous. But Medusa was different. She alone was mortal. She alone could die. And perhaps that vulnerability made her even more precious. But Medusa wanted no throne, no crown of divine favor, and no lovers. She chose something rarer: devotion. As a young woman, she entered the sacred service of Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom, war, and restraint. In the echoing marble temple, built high on cliffs above the sea, Medusa found her purpose. She swept the floors, lit the incense, and whispered prayers long before the dawn. She took the vows of chastity and purity, not because she was forced to, but because she believed in the ideal her goddess represented: strong, untouchable, and above the messy chaos of mortal hearts. Her life was bound in sacred duty, and in that duty she found peace. But beauty, even when hidden away in a holy temple, is not safe in a world watched by the gods. Word of Medusa's profound grace and stunning face spread beyond the temple walls, past the cities, and into the realm of the divine. And with that attention came danger. For in Olympus, desire often wore a powerful face, and the line between admiration and possession was razor thin. And one god in particular took notice. Not a god of wisdom or restraint, but a god of seas, storms, and insatiable appetites. And while Medusa kept her vows faithfully, fate had already begun to twist, because her sanctuary was about to become her prison. Far beneath the crashing waves, in his coral palace, Poseidon, god of the sea, took notice. He was a god of pride, fury, and a hunger that was never fully satisfied. And his eyes now turned to the mortal priestess, Medusa. It was her stillness, her discipline, her untouchable grace that obsessed him. She had chosen a life of devotion, placing herself far from the grasp of desire. And perhaps that was what tempted him most. One evening, when the tide was high and the temple was quiet and empty, Poseidon rose from the sea. He did not knock. Gods rarely ask permission. He entered Athena's sacred sanctuary, his divine presence a violation in itself, a trail of seawater soaking the polished marble floor. Medusa, alone and unsuspecting, was tending to the altar. She turned, only to find the great sea god looming in the shadows, his eyes filled with a terrifying resolve. She cried out to Athena, her voice echoing in the vast, empty hall. But her prayers were met with silence. She ran. But a temple built for worship is not designed for escape. And there, beneath the cold, unblinking stone gaze of Athena's own statue, Poseidon defiled what was sacred. It was not an affair. It was not a seduction. It was a brutal violation in the heart of his niece's holy ground. When it was over, he vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving nothing behind but the scent of salt and a profound, soul-shattering silence. Medusa, broken and shamed, curled into a ball on the temple floor, directly beneath the image of the goddess she had served. She waited for justice, for comfort, for any sign that her goddess would protect her. But the statue remained cold stone, and the help that was about to arrive would not be a comfort, but a punishment. For in the eyes of the gods, the crime was not the violation itself, but the desecration of divine property. And Medusa, the victim, was about to become the evidence of that crime. The temple floor was still stained with seawater when Athena returned. The incense had long burned out, and the silence was heavy, thick with shame and violation. At its center, Medusa knelt, her head bowed beneath the unblinking gaze of the goddess's statue. But when the real Athena appeared, her eyes were not filled with pity for her priestess. They burned with a cold, righteous fury. Her temple, her sanctuary of reason, discipline, and virgin purity had been defiled, and though it was her own uncle, Poseidon, who had committed the act, it was Medusa who would bear the blame. In the twisted logic of the gods, the crime was not the assault, but the pollution of a sacred space. Medusa, the victim, was merely the living evidence of the stain, and she had to be scrubbed from existence. Power protects itself, and Athena's power resided in her temple's inviolable purity. She stood over Medusa, who trembled, confused, still expecting mercy from the very goddess she had worshipped for years. But mercy was not given. "You have brought shame into my house." Athena's voice echoed like thunder between the marble walls. "Let the world see what becomes of beauty that invites such destruction." With a single, unforgiving gesture, the transformation began. It was immediate and horrific. Medusa cried out as she felt her beautiful hair begin to writhe and twist, thickening into coiling, living serpents, their hissing a cruel mimicry of her own whispered prayers. Her skin lost its warmth, and her gaze, her soft eyes once filled with devotion, became a weapon. They now held a terrible, petrifying power. Anyone who looked into them would turn instantly to cold, lifeless stone. It was not a curse meant as protection. It was a sentence of absolute isolation. A defense that ensured she could never again look upon another living soul without destroying it. She could never again know a friendly face, a loving glance, or even see her own reflection without it shattering. Athena did not weep. She did not turn away. She simply watched as her priestess, once beautiful and devout, became something else entirely, a monster. The great temple doors closed behind Medusa as she fled into exile. Her cries no longer human, echoing through the hills. Her old life was over, shattered in the space of an evening. And her new life, as one of the most feared and hunted monsters in the world, had just begun. Banished from temple and city, Medusa wandered into the wilderness, alone, cursed, and feared. Her steps carved a trail of stone across the land. Each accidental glance at a passing creature, a bird in mid-flight, a deer in the brush, even an insect that dared meet her gaze turned it to lifeless marble. She sought refuge where no man would follow, in the distant lands beyond rivers and ruin, to a bleak, windswept island at the edge of the world. The cave she entered was already half filled with the statues of long-forgotten warriors, beasts, or perhaps fellow wanderers who had met her eyes for a moment too long. And so began her second life, not as a priestess, but as a pariah. Medusa no longer wept. Tears belonged to the girl she once was, the girl who believed in justice and offered incense to Athena. That girl had died on the temple floor. In her place stood something else, not a monster, but a woman hollowed out and reshaped by betrayal. Her serpents, once the symbol of her curse, now whispered to her in dreams, not in words, but in instincts, warning her of intruders, hissing at the echo of approaching footsteps. Her hair had become her guardians, her eyes, her curse, her soul, a flickering memory. Occasionally, heroes would come, their armor glinting in the pale sun. They were lured by stories of a cursed Gorgon, tempted by the challenge of slaying a beast, believing she was evil, and that by killing her, they might rise in glory. But none of them returned. They underestimated her, not just her terrible power, but her pain. And they became new additions to her silent stone garden. With each death, Medusa felt less like the victim she was, and more like the very monster the world imagined her to be. Her humanity had not died, but it was fading, buried under layers of stone and solitude, forgotten by the very gods who had sealed her fate. Far from Medusa's cave, in the bustling city-states of Greece, her name began to change. It was no longer spoken in whispers of pity or mourning. It was passed from mouth to mouth like a chilling warning, distorted and reshaped with each retelling. She became Medusa the Gorgon, Medusa the cursed temptress, Medusa whose gaze turns men to stone. Her past as a devoted priestess, a mortal girl who served the gods with faith, was buried beneath the new myth. In its place rose a simple monster's tale, a creature with serpent hair whose eyes held the wrath of the underworld. They didn't tell of Poseidon's violation. They didn't mention Athena's cruel and unjust punishment. In the popular story, the gods' roles were edited out, smoothed over by priests and poets who preferred their deities spotless and their monsters clearly marked. Her face became a symbol of fear, a cautionary tale to frighten children. And while this new legend was taking root, a boy named Perseus was born into a different kind of prison. The son of Danae and Zeus, he was cast into the sea by a fearful king, but survived, washing ashore on the island of Seriphos. Years passed, and the king of that island, Polydectes, came to desire Perseus's mother for himself. Seeing the proud, protective son as an obstacle, the king devised a challenge, a quest so impossible it was meant to be a death sentence. At a feast, he mocked Perseus for having no gift to offer, and Perseus, stung by pride, promised to bring him anything he desired. The king sneered and named his price, "Bring me the head of Medusa." Perseus, unaware of the true story behind the name, accepted the quest, and the gods, with their terrible sense of irony, decided to help him. Athena, the very goddess who had cursed Medusa, now saw an opportunity to have her creation destroyed. She and the clever god Hermes came to Perseus in dreams, whispering guidance. They gave him divine tools for his journey, winged sandals to fly across the sky, a polished bronze shield that shone like a mirror, a sword sharp enough to cut through a monster's hide, and the helm of Hades, which would make him invisible to his foe. The same goddess who had punished a victim was now arming her killer. Perseus had been chosen, not just to slay a monster, but to be the final, tragic chapter in a myth that began with a girl, alone in a temple, praying to gods who would never listen. Perseus, armed with divine gifts and guided by the gods, set off on his quest. His journey first led him to the edge of the known world. where he found the Grey, three ancient sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them. By stealing their eye as they passed it to one another, he forced them to reveal the location of their sister, Medusa. Following their directions, he flew on his winged sandals across the ocean until he reached her bleak, windswept island. When he landed on the shore, the world seemed to hold its breath. There was no birdsong, no gentle breeze, only an eerie silence. And statues, hundreds of them, scattered across the cliffs and crags like fallen warriors, their faces twisted in expressions of final, shocking terror. These were the heroes who had come before him. He stepped carefully over stone limbs and shattered shields. His mirrored bronze shield held tight. Athena's warning echoed in his mind. Never look at her directly. Use the reflection. Be swift. Be silent. He moved deeper into the island, towards a dark cavern from which a faint hissing sound emerged. The serpents on her head sensed him before he saw her. Then she appeared in the shimmering reflection of his shield. But she was not the roaring, charging beast he had expected. Medusa was asleep, coiled on a bed of stone, her arms curled around herself like a child. In the distorted reflection, her face looked peaceful, almost fragile. The serpents rested on her brow in a tangled, dormant mass. She did not look like a monster. She looked like someone who had been left behind. Perseus hesitated. This was not the terror sung about in legends. This was a cursed, sleeping woman, utterly alone. But he remembered his quest. He remembered the mocking voice of King Polydectes, and he remembered his promise. He remembered glory, and so he raised the sharp, adamantine sword, his eyes fixed only on the image in the shield. As he stepped closer, one of the snakes lifted its head and hissed. Medusa stirred in her sleep, her brow furrowed on the verge of waking. In that moment, before her eyes could open, Perseus struck. The divine blade hissed through the air and met its mark. And then there was only silence. The curse was broken. The life of Medusa was over. We have seen the love to the gods as a curse, a deformation, and a betrayal. But now, we explore a love that acts as a cage, where the slightest gesture toward freedom is met with death. This story belongs, once again, to Apollo, the god of light, but this time, his light does not just burn, it casts an eternal shadow. The tale begins in the land of Thessaly, with a mortal princess named Coronis. Coronis was not just beautiful in the way mortals could describe. Her beauty held a warmth, a vibrancy, as if she had swallowed the morning sun. Her dark hair held hints of gold when the light caught it, and her smile could make winter flowers bloom. She was the embodiment of life, and so it was no surprise that she captured the attention of the sun god himself. Apollo loved Coronis, or at least he believed it was love. For a god accustomed to being the center of the universe, his love was possessive. Coronis was his world, and he could not bear the thought of that world being illuminated by any light but his own. Their affair took place in stolen moments, in golden afternoons spent in secluded groves. Apollo would come to her, setting aside his lyre and his laurel wreath, and simply be with her. But even in their most tender moments, there was an undercurrent of tension. He was a god, and his duties at his great oracle in Delphi often called him away. And in his absence, his divine insecurity began to fester. Trusting nothing in the world of mortals, Apollo left a guardian to watch over Coronis. This guardian was not a monster or a giant, but his own sacred pet, a great raven with feathers as white as the first snow. The raven was an intelligent, loyal creature, and it loved its master above all else. Its task was to observe Coronis and report any misdeeds. To Apollo, this was an act of protection. To us, it is an act of surveillance. Time passed, and in Apollo's long absences, Coronis began to feel lonely. The love of a god was intoxicating, but it was also distant and uncertain. She was still a princess, living in a world of mortal duties and connections. Her father had arranged a marriage for her with a mortal man, a prince named Ischys. Perhaps she felt the pressure of her family. Perhaps she craved a love that was stable, a love that did not vanish with the setting sun. Or perhaps she was simply human, with human desires and frailties. Whatever the reason, she lay with Ischys. And the white raven, perched on a branch nearby, saw everything. With a heart broken by this act of betrayal against its master, it wasted no time. Believing it was doing the right thing, it launched itself into the air and flew toward Delphi, a streak of white against the vast blue sky. Every beat of its wings was a pulse of urgency, carrying the news of infidelity to the god of truth and light. It did not know that, in its loyalty, it was carrying a death sentence not only for Coronis, but for its own snow-white plumage. It flew on, a messenger of truth, unaware that sometimes, to the gods, the truth is an unforgivable crime. The white raven flew without rest, its heart pounding with a sense of righteous duty. It arrived at Delphi and found its master in the majesty of his temple. Without hesitation, it told its story, describing in detail the scene it had witnessed Coronis, Apollo's beloved, in the arms of a mortal man. The raven expected a word of thanks, a recognition of its loyalty. It received something else entirely. As the raven's words fell upon Apollo's ears, a terrible change occurred. The god's face, usually as radiant as the sun, darkened. His fierce love for Coronis instantly curdled and shattered, turning into something hotter than the sun itself rage. It was the rage of a god betrayed, of pride wounded, and of possession challenged. He did not ask questions. He did not seek context. He felt only the sting of betrayal, and in his pain, he lashed out at the nearest object. He turned to the raven, his faithful messenger.
"You dare bring this dark news to me,"
he roared, his voice no longer music, but thunder. "You should have pecked out the mortal's eyes. You should have warned me before this dishonor occurred for your failure, for allowing your white eyes to witness this filth. You shall never be white again." With a wave of his hand, a dark curse enveloped the bird. Its snow-white feathers were scorched, turning the glossy, permanent black of coal of a moonless night. And that is why, the story goes, all ravens are black to this day. They wear the scar of a god's fury, a reminder that speaking truth to power can be a dangerous act. But Apollo's rage had only just begun. After punishing the messenger, he turned his attention to the source of his pain. Without a moment's hesitation, he reached for his silver bow, his instrument of precise destruction. He had no need to travel to Thessaly. From his temple in Delphi, his divine sight locked onto Coronis. He drew his bow, and with a low thrum, an arrow a sunbeam condensed into death was loosed, flying faster than sound, unstoppable. The arrow crossed mountains and valleys and found its mark. Coronis was in her home, perhaps reflecting on her choices, when a sharp, Cold pain pierced her chest. She looked down, bewildered, to see the silver arrow of Apollo embedded in her flesh. As her life began to fade, she whispered her last words into the air, a final rebuke to her divine lover. "You could have punished me alone," she said, "but now you have killed us both." And as those words, somehow, traveled to Apollo's ears, his rage evaporated as quickly as it had formed. It was replaced by a crushing, horrifying wave of regret. What had he done? In a blind moment of jealousy, he had murdered the woman he loved. He rushed to her side, but it was too late. He, the god of healing, stood helpless, watching his lover die from a wound of his own making. The fury of a god is a terrible thing, but his regret, perhaps, is even more devastating. The scene was tragic. Coronis was dead, and Apollo's grief was profound. He held her lifeless body, the air around him thick with the scent of the healing herbs he had uselessly summoned. But no magic could reverse his own act. As was the custom, her body was placed upon a great funeral pyre, wood stacked high to carry her on her final journey. The pyre was lit, and the flames began to lick at her burial shroud. Apollo stood there, a golden figure against the flickering firelight, and watched. He, the bringer of light, now watched the flames consume his love. He was the god of healing, yet he had inflicted a wound that could never be mended. It was a moment of utter powerlessness, a painful irony. But, as the fire roared highest, her last words echoed in his mind. "You have killed us both. The child, his unborn child, in a final, decisive moment." Apollo could not bear the thought that his child would also perish in the flames of his own regret. He could not save the mother, but perhaps he could save the son. As the fire raged at its most intense, Apollo did something no mortal could. He strode through the flames, untouched, and performed a divine Caesarean section. He reached into the pyre and carefully delivered his living son from the body of his dead mother. He had saved the child from the fire. He named the baby Asclepius. But as he looked upon the infant's face, Apollo felt not joy, but a painful, constant reminder of his own failure. This child was the legacy of his rage, a living symbol of the cruelty he had committed. Knowing he could not raise the boy himself, unable to face that daily reminder, Apollo sought a foster father. He entrusted Asclepius to the wisest and kindest teacher he knew, the centaur Chiron, the mentor of heroes. Under Chiron's care, Asclepius grew up, learning the arts of healing, of herbs, of compassion. He surpassed even his teacher, becoming the greatest healer the world had ever known, a man who could snatch souls from the very brink of death. Eventually, he was raised to Olympus as the god of medicine. And this is why it sucked to be Coronis. She was killed for a moment of human fallibility, executed by her lover's possessiveness. Her legacy was erased, her life becoming nothing more than the tragic prologue in the origin story of another male god. She died so that her son might live, a healer born from a wound that could never be healed. The love of Apollo did not give her life, it took hers, and turned her death into someone else's beginning. And so, the stories end. They end in ash, in stone, in lonely constellations and fields of flowers named for sorrow. As the dust of these ancient tragedies settles, a quiet question hangs in the air. When we look back at these lives, shattered by divine attention, Can we truly call the force that broke them love? Or was it something else entirely, something more primal, more possessive, and far more selfish? The love of the gods, it seems, was rarely about the beloved. It was almost always about the god. It was about Zeus's insatiable desire, a hunger that saw women not as people, but as fleeting conquests to be hidden, transformed, and ultimately forgotten when the consequences became inconvenient. His was not the love of a partner, but the whim of a collector. It was about Apollo's wounded pride. His pursuit of Daphne was not born of admiration for her spirit, but from the sting of rejection and the arrogance of a god who could not stand to be denied. He honored her not by letting her go, but by turning her escape into a permanent trophy for his own glory. It was about Aphrodite's vanity, a jealousy so profound that she would rather send a mortal girl through the trials of hell than share the world's admiration. The love Eros felt for Psyche may have been pure, but it was born from his mother's hatred, and every obstacle Psyche faced was a testament to that divine, petty cruelty. In these tales, love is not a connection. It is a justification for power. It is the name a god gives to his whim, a beautiful word to mask an ugly impulse. And perhaps this is why these stories have endured for so long. They are not just tales of ancient deities. They are mirrors. They reflect the most dangerous parts of the human heart, our own capacity for possessiveness, for envy, for a love that seeks to own rather than to cherish. The gods are simply us, with our flaws magnified to a cosmic, terrifying scale, wielding thunderbolts instead of just cruel words. And perhaps the most chilling part of these tales is not the selfish passion of the gods, but the profound and deafening silence that follows where justice ought to be. Where was the justice for Medusa, a priestess violated in her own temple, only to be cursed by the very goddess she had served with her life? Where was the justice for Io, turned into a beast and hunted across the known world, a helpless pawn in a bitter marital dispute? The stories show us, again and again, that it is the mortal victim who is punished. They bear the curse, the transformation, the exile, and often the blame. Semele is incinerated for a moment of doubt that a goddess planted in her mind. Callisto is cast out and turned into a bear for a violation she was powerless to stop. The gods, meanwhile, rarely, if ever, face consequences for their actions. Poseidon walks away from Athena's desecrated temple without a word of reprimand. Zeus continues his reign, his countless affairs a mere footnote in his grand legacy, his victims' lives destroyed in the process. This reveals something deep about the ancient Greek worldview. The gods were not seen as guardians of human morality. They were forces of nature, as unpredictable and as dangerous as an earthquake or a tidal wave. You do not ask a hurricane for justice. You simply try to survive its passage. Power, not fairness, was the ultimate law of their universe. To be loved by a god, then, was to be dragged into a game where you could not win, because the rules were written by the very beings who were playing against you. Your life, your body, your happiness, they were all just pieces on their celestial board. And the concept of justice, as mortals understand it, was a language the gods of Olympus did not speak. Their love was a form of cosmic weather, and the mortals caught in it were destined to be weathered away. So let us leave these stories now. Let us step away from the thrones of Olympus and the tragic fields of earth. Let the echoes of their sorrow fade into a gentle quiet. Imagine, if you will, a peaceful grove somewhere in Arcadia. The sun is setting, a soft breeze rustles the leaves of a laurel tree, and it is not a sound of a trapped spirit, but just the sound of the wind. A gentle whisper, with nothing left to say. Imagine a field in Sparta, where a single purple hyacinth blooms, not as a monument to a god's grief, but simply as a flower, beautiful and silent in the fading light. Imagine a sky empty of golden showers, of angry gods in pursuit, of watchful, jealous eyes. A sky that is just a sky, vast and peaceful. This is the world where beauty is just beauty, not a challenge. Where devotion is a quiet comfort, not a fatal vulnerability. A world where mortals are allowed to live their small, precious lives unnoticed. And perhaps that is the final lesson in these ancient tales. The greatest gift the gods could give a mortal was not their passion, not their attention, not even their immortality. It was their indifference. To be forgotten by them was to be free. To be unseen was to be safe. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, be thankful for the quiet, for the ordinary. You are safe from the gazes of Olympus. No god will chase you through the forest. No jealous queen will turn you into a beast. Your heart is your own. Sleep now. Let the mortal world hold you gently. Here, in the quiet dark, you are loved not with fire, but with stillness. And that is a blessing the gods themselves could never understand. Sleep well.